Afternoon. On behalf of the American Heart Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Prioritizing a Clinical Recommendation in the Echo Summary and Innovative Methods to Follow Through with Severe Aortic Stenosis Patients. I'm Sarah Donnelly, Program Consultant for Target Aortic Stenosis at the American Heart Association. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Kaylee Sadoff. Edwards Life Sciences is the national sponsor for the American Heart Association's Target Aortic Stenosis Initiative. I'd like to begin by going over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you would like a copy of today's presentation, you can download a PDF from the handout section of your attendee control panel. If you experience technical difficulties, most issues can be resolved by refreshing your browser, changing browsers, or making sure to allow pop-ups. If that does not work, please review the system requirements or contact GoToWebinar customer service team using the system requirements link found in your confirmation and reminder emails. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a link to access today's recording and an invitation to complete our feedback survey. We welcome you to submit questions for our presenters at any time in the questions pane of the control panel. We will collect your questions and address them at the end of our presentation as time allows. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Marielle Scher-Crosby. Dr. Scher-Crosby is the director of the Echo Lab and a professor of medicine at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group of the AHA's Target Aortic Stenosis Initiative, and the University of Pennsylvania is one of the 15 pilot sites who continues to participate in the initiative. Dr. Scher-Crosby, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Haley. Next slide. Next slide. So aortic stenosis is the third most common cardiovascular disease in Western country after CAD and hypertension. And calcific aortic stenosis affects more than 1.3 million people in the United States, including 12.4% of patients more than 75 years of age. The rate of calcific aortic stenosis is expected to double by 2050, mainly due to the aging of the population. And this is a disease that progresses approximately 0.1 millimeter square per year. Next slide. Next, thank you. So the natural history of aortic stenosis has been studied for now decades, and this is one of the early and very influential studies by Ross and Braunwald in 1968, showing that there is a very long latent period, but once the symptoms occur, the average age of death is between 2 and 5 years after. And this really led the way to try to have more sensitive methods to detect the progression of aortic stenosis before the onset of symptoms. Next slide. So the severity assessment of aortic stenosis really relies on imaging, as you can see here, mainly by echocardiography, transthoracic echocardiography, as you can see. However, there is a role both for dobutamine stress echo, and particular in low flow, low gradient severe aortic stenosis. And more recently, it has been shown that CT also has a role, especially in paradoxical low flow, low gradient aortic stenosis. Next slide. So I want to spend just a bit of time on the guidelines and the central role of echo in the guidelines. Next. So in yellow, I have shown, underlined, if you will, all the stages of the guidelines in which echo is crucial. And as you can see, both in recognition and detection, then in quantifying aortic stenosis, and then in taking the decision of intervention and the timing of intervention, echocardiography is crucial, as you can see here. And as you probably all know, the class 1 indications of intervention on aortic stenosis, on severe aortic stenosis, are when there are symptoms that are attributable to the aortic stenosis, or when the LVEF is less than 50%. Next slide. So the importance of following the guidelines have been underscored by several studies. And this is an interesting one from the team of Paul Saroja in Minneapolis. And what they did basically is that they had 300 patients who had severe aortic stenosis and a clear indication to be, the following the guidelines was a follow-up between 6 and 12 months up to the point where there would be an intervention, TAVR or SAVR, on the aortic stenosis. And they noticed that about a third of their patients, as you can see here from the 300 patients, were non-adherent to the guidelines. And the important finding that they had is that both actually death, heart failure hospitalization, and here in this figure you can see a combined endpoint of death and heart failure hospitalization, were worse in patients who were non-adherent to the guidelines than in patients who were. And they tried to adjust for all sorts of clinical factors that would explain this non-adhesion, but still found this difference. Next slide. So obstacles in following the guidelines in class 1 indications, and I want to emphasize this. This is a result from Europe, from Bernard Jung, and these are 28 sites from Europe. And you can see here that for aortic stenosis, there is about an 80% of following the guidelines in Europe. Now, this is not confined to Europe. Next. And this is a study that comes from the Mass General Hospital, which is a reputable site, with Sami El-Maria as the senior author. And you can see here, again, in patients who have class 1 indication for intervention, with symptoms, actually, they looked into that here, nearly 60% of patients had an intervention, but 40% did not. So let's dig a bit more in why those patients don't have intervention. Next slide. So the obstacles in following the guidelines, first of all, the patient medical status, and that comes from this MGH study. And you can see here that there's a whole load of clinical factors that have an impact on the fact that patients don't get intervened on. The worse the patients, the sicker the patients, obviously. For other comorbidities, the less likely they might have the intervention. Next. So here in yellow, I've underlined the different factors which had a magnitude of effect more than negligible. The age, comorbidities as congestive heart failure, renal failure, cancer, and the combined comorbidity index impacted the following the guidelines. Next slide. Other important issues in following the guidelines, and this is a very interesting study from Ashwin Nathan at Penn, in which he looked at more than 7,000 patients and looked actually at the impact of socioeconomic factors on the TAVR rate. And shown here are maps of Philadelphia and its region. And you can see here that the TAVR rate is inversely proportional to the number of patients or proportion of patients on Medicaid and the proportion of patients who are Black or Hispanic, underlining the important effect of these issues on following the guidelines. Next slide. Other obstacles in following the guidelines, the provider type. This is a study from the group of Patricia Pilica in the Mayo Clinic in, again, more than 7,000 patients from another source. And she looked at the role of the provider who was referring the patients to echo, a cardiac specialist or PCP. And here you can see there's a clear demarcation between the two, again, after adjusting for a different possible population who were seeing cardiac specialists or PCP. Next slide. Finally, here's an interesting study from Brennan et al. That looks inside the population of cardiologists who refer patients for echocardiograms and cardiology consults with severe AS. There is a great variability between the cardiologists in whether they're going to decide that their patients is going to have an intervention. And again, you know, adjusting for multiple cofactors, they did find that the provider's preference had an impact on A, following the guidelines, and two, as is shown in this graph, on the hazard of death in those patients. Next slide. And then finally, I want to also emphasize the role of the type of aortic stenosis. And mainly, as you can see here, this is again from this study from the MGH, looking at overall population of patients with a grade 1 indication to undergo intervention. And look at the two graphs on the right-hand side, low flow, low gradient, aortic stenosis have less of a chance to follow the guidelines. We don't exactly know all the reasons, and they may be very intricate, but that's also a factor that's an obstacle in following the guidelines. Next slide. So the American Society of Echo Foundation and the association has spearheaded an effort to look at the role of echocardiography report and how it, since echo is so intricate in all stages of aortic stenosis, if the echo report could be used to improve actually the following of guidelines in patients with severe aortic stenosis. And we were lucky with this team to be awarded this, this particular RFA. And this is a joint effort between the University of Pennsylvania, Lee Health in Florida, and the University of Virginia. Next slide. Next slide. And so I would like to, oh, don't go too fast. It's okay. It's fine. And I would like to spend the last few minutes of my talk talking about, you know, the pros and cons of an intervention. This work is ongoing, so you know there is no results at the moment, but certainly we can share our experience of trying to intervene in you know pushing the clinicians and the providers to follow the guidelines from the echo report. So first of all, there was a question of, you know, how do you decide who are the patients who are going to benefit from this intervention? We decided it would be patients with the diagnosis of severe AS as reported by the echo reader, as opposed to take, for example, hemodynamic results as, you know, again, in low flow, low gradient, for example, you don't have a high gradient. So we decided that we wanted the diagnosis of severe AS. Next. That's the explanation there. And then next. So that is the text that we have put in our EPIC order, echo order. This patient has been found to have severe aortic stenosis. National guidelines recommended that he be referred to a valvular heart disease specialist for further valve evaluation and management. And then we gave some ways to get to this valve evaluation and management: place an order or call a number. And as you know, another very important point of doing that sort of intervention in a report is that the patients are going to get the reports themselves. And we certainly have noticed a significant uptick from the patients themselves. So for patients, please call the provider who has ordered the echocardiogram to discuss. And a few things is you may notice here that follow your existing pathway to initiate the referral process if clinically appropriate. And that's an important point that I will develop in the next slide, which are practical tips and caveats. A tip is that you have to be, if you want to do such an intervention, very clear on the reminder that of guidelines. That's what you're emphasizing. That's what your argument is sitting on, if you will. Next. Each institution has to decide on the referral pathways. Are we referring the patients to a cardiologist, a valve clinic? This is all very institution dependent, and requires a lot of discussion and collaboration with the teams and with the surgeons, with the cardiologists, in order not to ruffle some feathers there. A caveat, for example, in one of our sites is that there may be some bypass. It may go directly to the surgeons, which may have some collateral effects that were not anticipated. Next. And I think that, one very important thing, and why I emphasized the, as the provider decides ultimately, is that diplomacy is paramount in that sort of intervention, in order not to burn bridges with collaborators, and really have a counterproductive effect of such interventions. So now again, we have not, the study is not finished, so we don't have any results. We will see if there is a positive impact of such intervention, but certainly we believe that it's very warranted, seeing everything that I've shown you before, and hope that it will give positive results. Next slide. Oh, the last thing is the involvement of patients, which I also mentioned on the previous slide, and which is a recent thing, but which I think is extremely important in all diseases, and in this one too, that the patient is engaged and involved in his or her own care. Next. So I want to thank the sponsors, the American Society of Echo, the NIH, University of Pennsylvania. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Sher-Crosby, for that insightful overview. I would like to introduce our next speaker. Michelle Leginsky is an assistant nurse manager in the cardiac cath lab at Virtua Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Camden, New Jersey. We are so thrilled to have her join us today to highlight how her team implemented a new system of following up with severe aortic stenosis patients. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, so my name is Michelle. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share this project that we kind of just happened to take on. And as part of the collaboration with the AHA and Target AS, we had shared that, we were doing something that may be of value for the other people that are partnering with this project. So go ahead for next slide. Thank you. And so what we did is we did an echo query, and the result of the echo query kind of led us down this path of trying to figure out how we could grow our program and increase our referrals. Next slide. So we are Virtua Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital. We are located in Camden, New Jersey, which is right outside Philadelphia. Our hospital has 340 beds. A little bit of background to our program, which is relevant to our timeline. We were purchased by Virtua about 5 years ago. Prior to that, we were a part of a different hospital system. And so our hospital started doing TAVRs in 2013. We had gone without a TAVR coordinator for a few years. In 2016, I was kind of brought to the hospital to restart and revamp the program. At that time, it was just myself and a nurse practitioner. So we were doing the best that we can. Next slide. And so this is kind of what we are now. So we are a hospital-based program. We have 3 interventional cardiologists. We work with 4 cardiothoracic surgeons, and what started out as just myself and a nurse practitioner has now grown. So we have 3 mid-level providers, 1 mostly in the office, 1 mostly in the hospital, 1 kind of splits her time. We have a navigation team who navigates all of our structural procedures. We have staff that just primarily work in the valve clinic office, and then myself and 1 other staff member primarily work just in the hospital setting. So following our timeline a little bit, like I said, in 2019, we became part of Virtua's system. So Virtua then wanted to see what did we need, what kind of resources did we need to grow the program. In 2021 is when we developed the brick and mortar valve clinic, which is before that was just, we were just kind of piecemealing everything together from different cardiologists' office. So really in between 2019 to 21 is really where we started to put our policies and processes in place. Next slide. So this is our volumes comparing 22 and 23. So you will notice that there is a little bit of a drop in TAVR volume between 22 and 23, yet we had a growth in other structural procedures that we were doing. So some of the growth in the other procedures was related to the outreach work that we were doing with primary cardiologists, but we weren't really sure what we were missing with the drop in the TAVRs. Next slide. We did know that since the creation of the brick and mortar valve clinic, we had 316 referrals to valve clinic that year, and then it was growing. But we still felt like we were missing some of the referrals out there. Next slide. This is a breakdown of what our typical referrals look like, and I think our referral pattern is pretty similar to most structural programs. About a little more than 60% of it is AS evals for aortic stenosis. Next slide. And this is where our referrals are coming from. So Virtua Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital is one of 5 hospitals in our system. We have 48 cardiology offices, which I feel like just continue to keep growing. We have 29 PCP offices, and we have over 80 cardiology providers. So those 80 providers include subspecialties of cardiology like EP, CT surgery, and it also includes our mid-level providers. So some of our mid-level providers see patients in a discharge clinic, so they will sometimes send referrals for patients that might have been in the hospital and found to have AS. So we include them in our list as well. And then I also think it's an important note to make that we do deal with one private cardiology group, and while their procedural volume is low here, they do still do a fair amount at another hospital system close by. So we are typically pulling patients from mostly South Jersey. That map is kind of our heat map of where we focus some of our outreach events, but realistically, we're seeing our referrals from like Central Jersey all the way down to the bottom of the state. Next slide. All right, so the inspiration for our AS Echo query. So in 2022, I had been approached by industry in the mitral world for a project that they wanted to do to see if they in-service echo techs. Could we then prove that the improvement of scanning the images might lead to more referrals for MR? So what that project involved was regular in-service with the techs, regular communication with the reading cardiologist, and then we were also starting echo queries. It's important to note that at that time, we were also fairly new to Epic, our EMR system. So we were also partnering with IT to identify some of the needs of the programs. What kind of reports can we develop with Epic? What kind of templates can we now create? And wait a minute, if we're doing echo queries for MR, could we possibly pull this into the AS realm? So we just had somebody in the valve clinic do a random echo query for AS patients, and they found that there was over 200 patients that were not currently in the valve clinic referral pathway that had met criteria for referral to valve clinic. So when I say met criteria, we were going strictly on numbers and measurements in that echo report only. So knowing that, we started to socialize this idea during our outreach events. And when we met with some of the physicians, like, hey, what do we do with this? Like, there's all of these patients out here. Why are we not getting them? How do we get them? Do we need to improve our outreach? Do we need to, improve our communication? What can we do to help you take care of your patients? And then the final important piece of how things just all line up the way they're meant to be, we were also invited to partner with AHA for the Target AS project. So the structural heart program felt that for maybe some of those cardiologists who are still a little hesitant of sending us those referrals, maybe if we had these guidelines that were going to come out by the AHA, we could use that to support our cause that, hey, this patient, yes, it's moderate AS, but it's better to get them referred now. Let us just keep an eye on them. Let us keep them in the queue so that we can get intervention, if appropriate, at the best time. Next slide. So the results, so what happened? So between July of 2023 and January of 24, there was a lot of work put in by the valve clinic staff. They basically ran an echo report through Epic to find any patient that might have had an echo done in that timeline who met criteria, or at least to consider being evaluated to the valve clinic. They generated 70 letters at that time to the cardiologist that identified patients for possible evaluation to the valve clinic. The work that went into it was quite extensive. They were deep diving into these patients' charts. So we weren't just going by echo measurements. Were they appropriate patients? Did they need to be excluded because they were on hospice? Was the echo done during a hospital admission that maybe we just needed to follow up, once discharged? But similar to what Dr. Cheryl Crosby had mentioned, we created this verbiage for that communication. So our verbiage was pretty similar, as you can see, but basically we put, based on findings of the most recent echocardiogram, your patient meets clinical criteria to at least be considered for evaluation in the valve clinic. Would you like our team to help you by placing a referral for evaluation? So the results. So we had a 30% average yes for referral, for immediate referral. The percentage definitely varied among the subgroups of our cardiologists. So we had 4 separate groups of cardiologists who practiced together, and 2 of them, we had about a 50% immediate yes, and the other 2 was much lower, which is how we kind of got our 30% average. So we definitely knew that, the cardiologists were willing. We just needed to figure out what that appropriate referral pathway was going to now look like. Go ahead. So looking at what our numbers now for the next 5 months, since we're still in the month of June. So valve clinic new patient volume has definitely gone up. So remember, our echo query, we ran it from July of 23 to January of 24, and you can already see the increase in referrals that we had gotten this year compared to last year. It wasn't quite yet referred or translating into the same percentage of procedural volume, but anecdotally, what I can tell you is that we're seeing a lot of moderate AS patients now being referred into the valve clinic. So while the valve clinic referral volume is much higher, we are still seeing an increase in the procedural volume, and then we're holding on to those patients in the valve clinic, just monitoring them. A lot of times the verbiage in the office might be, if your symptoms start to worsen before your next, you're due back, they have that point of contact to reach out to let us know, or even if it's their primary cardiologist, because they're kept in the loop the whole time as well. Next slide. Okay, so our barriers noted. So what were our challenges running this report and trying to get these patients in? We definitely needed to be mindful of the physician's preference. Right off the bat, we had one cardiologist that said, please don't send me these messages. I will handle my patients. They are going to be seen regularly. And honestly, he's one of the highest referring physicians, so we weren't really worried about those referrals not coming. But also, how could we help if the echo findings showed that maybe an echo done now that's to be followed up in 6 months with an office visit might need to have an office visit, rescheduled to a sooner date? Can we help with that? Can we have access to your scheduling, because we're all part of the same system? It was also, like I said, quite labor intensive for the staff who did the chart audits. They were going into the chart audit. They were looking for the pre-existing medical conditions. They were also looking for the mental capacity. Was there any Alzheimer's or dementia noted? Was there any way that we could possibly exclude this patient out and justify maybe not having gotten the referral earlier? And then with that, as we were generating these new referrals, we had a really good problem. Our infrastructure of the current valve clinic capacity definitely needed to be identified, and we needed a resolution. So we are currently in the process of creating some satellite valve clinics in other offices, which is also matching the strategy to kind of reach out a little bit further to referring physicians. Next slide. All right, and then our lessons learned and our key takeaways. What did we get out of this? Do we want to run this report again? Is this something where we do every other year? Is this something where we do when we start to see our referrals drop? What do we want to do with the results? So I think the biggest thing is just the awareness and the presence. I can't say that just running the echo query is what created all of this volume. However, we are in the front of their minds now a little bit more. We definitely believe that the increase in referrals is a result of all of our combined efforts, both the outreach events, the communication that we have with the cardiologist, and knowing that, hey, we care about your patients and we're taking a look at these echoes for you. We also learned, and this is an easy one, there's multiple pathways for referrals of patients. So whether that referral was coming from just an Epic message, or whether the physician was putting in that ambulatory referral themselves, or if they were just making a notation on an echo report. We have one reading physician who will just kind of put a little blurb at the end of the report that to the primary cardiologist, hey, I read this echo. Based on the findings, you may want to consider referring to valve clinic. The other thing that we learned is that we need support from all angles. So we already had the support from administration. We knew that we needed the cardiologist to buy in on it and for their participation. And then we also knew that, our staff, because now we've grown a lot, we needed to make sure that our scripting was on point and consistent across the board. It's hard if you're calling a patient and you're saying, I'm calling from the hospital and you had an abnormal echo, you need to see a specialist. That's not received very well, but it might be received a little bit better, if you tell the patient, I'm calling from Dr. So-and-so's office, remember that test that he had you get done, the test, result, it looks like it's a little different compared to the last one, and he wants you to see one of his partners for evaluation. And even then, if the patient was not happy with that and wanted to see their primary cardiologist, great. Let me find a way to help you get that appointment moved up sooner. And then finally, one of the projects that the Valve Clinic is now doing is we are helping to revise those echo report templates. We're creating a best practice advisory in Epic so that now there's an alert that will pop up if a patient is found to meet criteria for a referral based on just the echo readings alone. So I definitely think that the echo query, there was value to it. And like I said, who knows what the next 6 months or a year will look like. Our projected volume for this year is probably going to be over 300 TAVRs, which is, quite an increase from last year's 215. So maybe we don't need to do it right now. Maybe it's something that we just need to keep an eye on because there's always going to be patients that fall through the cracks. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to move forward with the results that we found from our first query. So that was just what we wanted to share with everyone.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to both of our presenters for sharing their great quality improvement successes. It was great to hear from you. I'll now see if there are any questions in the chat to allow time for additional discussion. Kaylee, any questions in the chat?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thanks again to both of our presenters. The first question is for Dr. Cher Crosby. The question is, what was your largest barrier you faced as you began your intervention of putting that clinical recommendation in the echo report?
Well, that's a great question. I think the biggest barrier was actually, for lack of a better term, psychological. There was some pushback from, in particular, some of the cardiologists. And that's why you have to phrase the language so delicately, if I may say, because there was a concern that, if we mentioned, for example, a valve clinic, that they would never see their patients again. There was also some sort of ruffled feathers, if I may say, from people who, think that they know this, and so why bother, why add something on the report. One thing that we did to allay those concerns, so first of all, we had to modify the language. It took quite a few iteration, and I know that even and this is so institution dependent. I mean, because I know that our collaborators have a very slightly different language because they didn't have the same issues. So we don't mention any valve clinic, for example. We just mention a cardiac specialist. So that's the way we solved that. Another thing that we do is that we have left it so in our EPIC report, and different institutions have different reporting system, obviously. So we happen to work with EPIC and Cupid. So there are two places that this nudge, this little sentence there is inserted. One of them is in the final report, and then there is another place which is a bit more hidden, but which is still in the overall report. And so when the report goes to, say, an interventional cardiologist or a grumpy surgeon, then we take off, the reader has the possibility to take off what's on the summary. The reader doesn't have the possibility to take off everything from the report. The other place where this sentence is will stay, but it's much, much less in your face. So we have the possibility to take off this summary, and also because it's not useful, honestly. I mean, a lot of referring physicians are already aware of all this. So we don't have to really bother everyone with that particular statement. So that's how we dealt with it. So that's what I would say was the major obstacle in our hands. I don't know about you, Michelle.
Yeah, I agree. I think being mindful of those physician preferences is definitely key. We are still trying to figure out what that verbiage is going to look like on our echo reports. And it's why we are very excited to see the results of the Target AS, to see what guidelines the AHA might come out with as well, just to kind of use that as a little extra nudge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe the
Haley,
next
any more question?
Oh, excuse me. The next question, I believe, is for you, Michelle. You talked a little bit about industry getting you started with the mitral valve. Can you explain how you got that EPIC best practice query to be implemented on the aortic side? I'm not sure if the asker meant more from, an administrative standpoint, or, how you got that through.
So it was kind of by accident. So if administration had already agreed to let us do the echo query for the MR, if we just happened to run it for AS, what kind of results were we going to get? And I think they were very surprised to see that there were over 200 patients out there that did meet the criteria that hadn't yet been referred. So once we kind of socialized that out and word was getting out that there were still a lot of patients that we could help, I think that's kind of when we had the buy-in and the support to, run this query, try it for 6 months. What can we do with it while being mindful and respectful to the primary cardiologist as well?
Can I add something about, and I would be happy to hear what Michelle has to say about that. The best practice advisory, and again, this is very institution specific, I guess, but the best way for the providers to respond, we decided against the best practice advisory because for better or for worse, at least in our institution, we felt that there was an over reliance on those, and so the clinicians are just so done with all those best practice advisory that we felt that adding one more would not be as helpful as just having this in the report. I was wondering if you had a different experience on that.
No, that has been brought up as well. So we're gonna see where we go with this, and we're still in the beginning phase of developing that. So again, we'll kind of do it like we did with the echo query. We'll kind of socialize that out, and then maybe I can report back in 6 months and let you know how that goes.
Thank you. So Michelle, you've talked about some of the barriers and takeaways and showing some results for this year so far. Do you have next steps, or do you plan to do another round of this? I know it was pretty labor intensive on your part, but being able to show those yielded results, wondering if you are going to be able to continue, or your plans for next steps.
So I know the next steps for our program overall was the satellite clinics. So realizing that, okay, if we're going to generate the referrals, we have to have a place and a space to put them. So I think the satellite clinics has taken priority right now. And then we'll see what the volumes look like. And I also know that the valve clinic is in the process of streamlining their process, and they've even hired another navigator. So I think there will be an opportunity to do it again. I just don't know what the frequency of that is yet.
Wonderful. And I think this question could be posed to both of our presenters today. So kind of a statement and then a question. I'll read it all. This is a very common issue, and so glad you're attacking this. Back in 2020, Lee Barnhart, Martin Thomas McCarthy had an article in JACE in March calling out the need for CHO alert. I like your emphasis on the system to diplomatically spur appropriate referral. So the question is, would there be any medical liability if PCP or cardiology doesn't respond or act on your call out?
You know, that's a really good question, actually. I think that, you know, the best we can say is that this is an issue that could be, and one of our sites, actually, we had a lot of issues with the IRB that came back with this very question. This could be said of any guidelines. It's not like specific to aortic stenosis. I guess that if, you know, if there's any issue and if a clinician is not following guidelines and not justifying why he or she is not following guidelines, there can be some legal repercussion. I'm not sure that having a little blurb in the echo report makes or doesn't make a difference. We were, you know, finally able to get through the IRB by saying this was a quality improvement project, and you know, that's this was part of an overall movement of, you know, following the guidelines. You know, that it might be that there will be some unanticipated consequences. But again, I don't think it's any different from any other indications where you know, following the guidelines, you know, you can, if you do not follow the guidelines and if there's no justifications, you can probably get attacked for that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think keeping that in mind is part of the reason why we did invest so much time into going through those charts, because we wouldn't want to put that recommendation out for a patient who really only met criteria by numbers alone and not the overall clinical picture. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think there would be that possibility.
Yeah, I think that's why we introduced that language in the echo report to say, you know, as determined by the clinician, because ultimately, I mean, you know, there is a lot of those cases that, you know, if you know, follow very rigidly, as Michelle is saying, the guidelines, and you say, well, this is an indication for the guidelines, but then you realize that the patient is probably not in a state that he or she can, you know, undergo the procedure. There's also patients who decline. Yeah, I mean, that we have certainly found that, and you know, you can always argue that maybe we're not convincing enough, but maybe we are, and it's, you know, free choice. Yeah.
Wonderful. I believe that will be the last question we have for today's webinar. So I'll turn it over to Sarah to wrap up.
Kaylee, and thank you to both of our presenters today, and thank you everyone for attending. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the survey of the presentation. We would love and appreciate your feedback. In that email, you'll also receive a link to the recording of today's presentation. On behalf of the American Heart Association and the Target Aortic Stenosis Initiative, thank you for joining us and have a great day. This concludes today's presentation.
Great. Are we supposed to say anything more, or are we done?
I wasn't sure if we were doing like a wrap up.
We're all done. Thank you. Yep.